and welcome to the Houston Real Estate Talk with Stone and Fields. Today I'm here with Phil Livingston. Welcome, Phil.
Good morning, Kariliz.
Thank you, thank you. Phil Livingston is an attorney, and he's an experienced business and real estate litigator, right?
Correct.
Very good, very good. He's been licensed since 1985 and lots of experience. That's amazing.
A long time.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you again, Phil. We appreciate your time. Today we want to talk about the tenant and landlord relationships. How's that?
That'll be good.
Okay, I have a bunch of questions, so let's get started. All right. What do you do, or should a tenant do if there's a problem? Once the tenant moves in to the house and all of a sudden, oops, something broke. And what's that? What do you do from there?
The first thing a tenant should do always is read the lease and make sure what the lease says, the tenant's rights are, and how to contact the landlord or the landlord's agent. Having read the lease, then the tenant should absolutely contact the landlord in the manner described in the lease. Okay. If there's any doubt, then make a phone call, send an email, do whatever makes sense in the circumstances. If the problem is immediate, then treat it as immediate. If it's not a problem that needs to be resolved immediately, then give the landlord some time to respond.
Okay. And what is the acceptable turnaround for repairs?
That is going to depend.
Okay.
It's going to depend in part on what the lease says. In part, it's going to depend on when the repair needs to be made. So if it's, late on a Saturday night, it may take a couple of days just to organize the right people or the right equipment to make that repair.
Right.
And certainly how the tenant communicates the need for that repair to the tenant will influence how quickly the landlord responds and how quickly the landlord is able to recognize that the matter needs to be repaired quickly, as opposed to something that could take a little bit more time.
Makes sense. And here I have a question, and I'm jumping through a few of the questions because this one is related to what we're just talking about. And it's when can the tenant withhold the rent? If there's a problem and the landlord takes his beautiful time, 2 days, 3 days, can the tenant, does the tenant has the right to withhold any rent, or in what circumstance can that happen?
Generally, the tenant does not have a right to withhold rent.
Okay, good to know.
There are a few circumstances where the condition of the property becomes a danger to the tenant in some fashion, and in those circumstances, the tenant may have a right to withhold rent. Okay. But those are going to depend on the circumstances that arise under that lease and with that particular property. Gotcha. But the general answer is the tenant has an obligation to pay rent.
Got it. Makes sense. Okay. When is the landlord obligated to return the deposit?
The landlord is obligated to return the deposit when the deposit needs to be returned. Let me say it that way. The landlord has an obligation to inform the tenant within 30 days. And if a portion of the deposit or all the deposit is going to be returned, to return that portion or all of the deposit within the 30 days. Okay. But there are circumstances in which the landlord may not have an obligation to return the deposit, but the landlord still has an obligation to make a written report, send a letter, do something in writing to the tenant to say, this was your deposit, this is why I'm not returning it.
Got it. And this is in the case that the tenant already moves out. They completed their term based on the contract, right?
Right.
And they moved out.
Right.
And then that's when the landlord has 30 days to return this deposit. And if it's not returning the deposit or partial, some part of the deposit, then they have to put it in writing and specify why and what are the things why they're withholding that part of the deposit.
Right. Whether there were no problems under the lease during the term of the lease, or whether the lease was a problem from the first day, the landlord always has an obligation to give a written statement to the tenant 30 days after the end of the lease, however that's defined, explaining why the deposit is being withheld or what portion of it's being withheld.
Gotcha. And would you give any deposits, going back to the deposits, we're talking about the return of the deposit, but would you give any deposits to, when you're applying to a lease, to a property, would you give any deposit without an executed lease?
Before you execute the lease?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Mm-hmm.
No, I would, only for, if I'm talking to a tenant,
right.
only have them deliver the deposit when the lease is executed.
Very good. Very good. Yes, it makes total sense. And the reason why I'm asking is because I've heard of other property management companies or landlords that they're requesting the deposit to be wired or sent before the tenant receives the executed lease, which for me, it's like, it doesn't make any sense. And I just see trouble down the day,
right.
It doesn't.
There may be circumstances where the tenant, because of negotiations back and forth,
right.
that the tenant has the last version of the lease that the tenant is satisfied with.
Mm-hmm.
And so the tenant executes the lease and delivers a check with the lease as a security deposit, with the expectation that the landlord won't do anything with the security deposit until the landlord executes the lease himself or herself.
Right.
But if there's some doubt as to whether the landlord's going to execute the lease, there doesn't seem to be any reason to send a security deposit.
No, for sure not.
Yeah.
When we're talking about pets, I know this is like a lease by lease case, and going back to the deposits and things like that. And every lease might be different. Some of them might require a non-refundable deposit, and others will require, will allow for a refundable deposit. Tell me a little bit about the pet situation.
Pets are negotiated on a lease by lease basis, as you noted. They're not necessarily controlled by the statute. So if the landlord's requirement is a non-refundable security deposit, that should be stated in the lease.
Right.
If I think that generally, if a deposit is not described as non-refundable, there's a good argument that it is refundable, and the landlord would have to explain why it's not being refunded.
Got it.
But I know that there are landlords whose practice is to always require a non-refundable deposit for pets because they know they're going to be cleaning requirements that are different and other obligations.
Correct, especially with the air vents and things like that, or window screens, all that type of special cleaning on the carpet and other items like that.
And because pets are different. They're some are oily, some are dry, some are cleaner than others. Some are outdoor pets, some are indoor-outdoor pets.
True.
It just depends, and so that's something that the landlord and the tenant always negotiate.
Got it, and should be considered at all times. What advice would you give the tenants and landlords before signing a lease?
I think two things that I would recommend before signing the leases. One is, unless there's no opportunity, the tenant should actually look at the property and make sure that the property they're looking at is the property that they're going to be leasing. The second thing, which everybody should do regardless, is read the lease. If they're not reading the lease, there's going to be something in there that later on they won't be able to say, oh, I didn't know that was there.
Right. True. Totally true. And I agree. Also, people don't look at the property, in before moving in, and then they complain after they move in about something that they should have noticed before moving in. Although let's talk about the inventory and condition form, that's where that comes into, they have a specific days after they move in to send to the landlord and give a report of the condition of the house. What happens if they don't send it within that period of time that is specified on the lease?
If they don't send back the condition form, then the landlord will be able to say, there weren't any problems there.
Gotcha.
You as the tenant moved in, you had 10 days or 2 weeks or whatever the period was, and you didn't make any notes. You didn't tell me there was a problem. So I, as the landlord, get to say there weren't any problems there. And if a month after you move in, but 2 weeks after you didn't return the condition form, there's a problem. That's a new problem, that didn't exist when you came onto the property.
Right. So the advice for the tenant would be, number one, fill out that inventory and condition form within the days specified on the contract. And number two would be on the tenant also to make sure that it is delivered to the landlord, and at least the landlord acknowledges that it was received.
Right.
That's for sure very important.
Right.
So that way nobody can say, I didn't know about it or I didn't receive it, right?
Correct. And the third thing that I would add to that in our current era of cell phones and is that take a picture. If there's a problem that is a visual problem, take a picture,
Right.
include it with the condition form when you return it to the landlord.
Right.
The other thing that when you move in, take a picture as well.
Sure, of
So
the condition
that-
of the house, and
Right.
especially also if you have pets with dogs that could scratch the floors or cats that could damage window screens and things like that. It's good that you oversee all of those little items before and you take pictures, which is a great advice,
Right.
taking the pictures. I like that one. If there's something broken, or the AC stops working or the dishwasher stops running, can the tenant withhold part of the rent to make the repairs themselves without, notifying or letting the landlord know about that?
Not without notifying the landlord.
Okay.
The tenant always needs to notify the landlord of the problem so that the landlord can take care of the problem. There's a presumption that the landlord is more interested in caring for that property than the tenant would be. And also in many circumstances, the landlord has relationships with plumbers and electricians and carpenters and whoever
Right.
that the tenant might not have. But the
Right.
tenant needs to give the landlord first notice before making the repair himself.
And should they get, based on what we're talking about, I'm assuming that they should get at least a written okay from the landlord saying, yes, it's okay that you withhold whatever amount of dollars from the rent.
Right. I mean, the best practice, or certainly a good practice, would be if you notify the landlord and the landlord doesn't respond, is to then have, if you can, 2 estimates or 3 estimates for the cost of that dishwasher repair, whatever it
Okay.
is, and give those to the landlord.
Good.
And then if there's still no response, reach out again and say, I'm going to choose this person to do the repair.
Right.
But read the lease. Get back to read the lease, because
Yes.
that may be one of the things that you have the opportunity to repair for yourself and withhold rent, or
True.
it may have been your expense all along.
True. Okay. Very good. Very good. Yes, like refrigerators. In some leases, the refrigerator is excluded from the landlord's responsibilities to be repaired.
Right.
Of repairs. So, totally right. If natural disaster happens, then let's say the lease ends in May and something happens in August. Like what the same thing that happened with Harvey, right? A lot of
Right.
people have to evacuate their homes and all of that. What's the responsibility between landlord and tenant there?
At that point, in that sort of natural disaster, the tenant should, at the earliest opportunity, say the property's no longer livable,
Right.
for whatever reason, because of the natural disaster, and say that they've moved out, or that they're in the process of moving their property
Okay.
out.
Okay.
That way, the landlord's on notice that the tenant has left the property, and that it's then the landlord's responsibility to make sure that the property is preserved, that things don't happen because it's now empty.
Right. So once the tenant moves out, the responsibility of the tenant is done because they give notice. This is no longer livable. I moved out. Now it becomes 100% the responsibility of the landlord, whatever is inside and left behind in the house. Is that correct? Somewhat.
It's going to depend. I hate to be the lawyer on this one,
Yes.
but it's going to depend.
Right. Yes.
The tenant will have a responsibility if the tenant is still occupying any portion of the property.
Got it.
So even if the tenant has said all of this furniture is now destroyed and left it behind, it's still the tenant's property.
Got it.
And so the tenant is sort of leaving his property in the landlord's property at that point. So the tenant may have obligations with respect to what happens if you leave a wet couch inside a house.
Okay.
And so the tenant wants to make sure that the tenant has taken care of their property in terms of moving it out or making sure the landlord knows it's there or whatever makes the most sense. But once the tenant is fully out of the property and the tenant has said, I can't live there because of the hurricane or whatever, then the landlord will definitely have a primary responsibility to make sure that the locks work, that the windows are all there, that whatever other security issues the landlord may have.
Very good, very good. And when we're talking about evictions, tell me a little bit about the process of eviction. The tenant does not pay the rent. When does the landlord has the right to start the process? And what are the tenant's rights? That type of thing.
In the process,
yes.
Certainly. The landlord has the right the day after rent is last due.
Okay.
So if the lease says rent's due on the 1st, but it's not late until the 5th, then the landlord on the 6th can start the eviction process.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And depending on how the lease is written, the landlord can start charging late fees and whatever else is in the lease.
Right.
So the landlord has to give written notice that rent is due and give the tenant an opportunity to pay that rent plus whatever late fees or whatever penalties are in the lease. If the tenant doesn't pay the rent, then the landlord can start the eviction process, which is a filing with the justice of the peace for that area.
Okay.
And then the justice of the peace will issue a citation, and the sheriff will serve the citation either on the tenant directly or by posting it on the property.
Like a sticker?
With a copy of it, basically tacked to the front door.
Okay.
In some fashion. But they'll try first to get it served on the individual.
Got it.
If not, then they'll give notice to whoever's actually there before they just leave it on the front door. Once they've given service under whatever authorized method they have for giving service, then the 7-day time frame runs from the date of service to when the hearing will be on the eviction proceeding.
It's very lengthy. How long does all of these could take?
It'll take about 10 days.
Ah, okay. Sounds longer than what it actually...
sounds longer than it was, yeah. From when it's first filed, you have to give notice, the written notice. So that may be 2 weeks or 10 days or some period of time, generally stated in the lease.
Okay.
And then from there, having filed it in the justice court, it'll take about 10 days normally to get to a hearing, sometimes 2 weeks, depending on how busy the justice court is. And then the tenant can show up and explain why they haven't paid rent, or if the tenant's not been able to talk to the landlord for some reason, or if the landlord is willing to work something out.
Right.
A lot of that happens in the courthouse. But
at the beginning, they don't want to talk, and then when they show up to the courthouse, they're willing to come up to an agreement.
A sheriff knocking on your door tends to get people's attention.
For sure.
In a lot of ways.
For sure.
So,
yes.
And then, but if the tenant doesn't show up, or if the tenant does show up and the court still orders the eviction, then the tenant has 7 days to move out.
Got it. Okay. Okay.
And in those circumstances, the landlord should probably, make some effort to keep an eye on their property.
Right.
Just because bad things have happened.
Yes.
But generally, tenants move out, and then the landlord has to clean up and
release the property
right. And even in that setting, just to be clear, even in that setting, even though there's been an eviction and all the rest of it, the landlord still has an obligation to send that 30-day notice of what the landlord's doing with the security deposit.
Okay. Okay. Yes, let's not forget about the security deposit.
Right.
So they still have the right. Well, in this case, they will retain and they will keep the security deposit.
Most often, yes, but sometimes no.
Okay.
But even if they're keeping it all, they still have an obligation to send the letter.
And not letting them know.
Right. I mean, a landlord doesn't want to get in the position of having done everything right, but send the letter.
Yes.
And then get sued later on because they didn't send a letter.
And the tenant didn't know.
Right.
What was happening with my money.
Right.
Got it.
The other problem is if the landlord doesn't send the letter, the landlord may not have the right to keep any of the deposit.
Oh.
So
tricky.
They need to send the letter.
Yes. So the key words during this conversation has been, number one, read your lease.
Read your lease.
That's number one.
Always.
Walk the house before moving in and take pictures, because we have phones and cameras all over the place.
Right.
We have access to that. There's no excuse.
Right. And don't take pictures of just the problems.
Right.
Just
everything.
Take everything.
The general.
Right.
Yes.
This is the condition of the house. Right.
Got it. And include it, if possible, with the inventory and condition form.
Correct. And if you have a yard, if you're renting a house where you have a yard and plants and flowers and that are already there, take pictures of those.
Absolutely.
And if there's outdoor furniture that are being leased, take pictures of that.
Right. Yes.
Take a picture of the garage if the garage is a separate building.
True.
Whatever you as the tenant are going to be responsible for returning to the landlord.
Right.
Take a picture of it.
Yes, that makes sense. Also, appliances, because you don't know if throughout the lease it breaks and then it has to be replaced, and then everybody forgets that it was this brand and now a different brand or style or color, and then it becomes a big deal. Don't you remember? No, I don't remember.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
No, all those happen all the time.
Exactly.
They do. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then so. Read the lease, write everything, put it in writing, send notifications. The landlords always inform the tenants always put it in writing and send it to the landlord. So that way we avoid everybody saying, I didn't know, or I forgot, or you never told me.
Right.
And the other thing is taking pictures. So anything else that we should add
Pay
to advice?
Rent.
Pay your rent on time.
Pay your rent.
Yes, because, I've never heard of somebody the day after the rent was due to start the eviction process, but I'm sure that it happens a lot, more often than probably we can even imagine. So,
I mean, the thing that the tenant should keep in mind is that the landlord, for whatever reason, has chosen to lease their property out.
Right.
Maybe it's because that's what they do as a business. Maybe it's because they're out of the country for 2 years on their own job or whatever. Right. But the landlord's most interested at that point in collecting the rent.
Of course.
And if the rent is being paid and being paid timely, landlords are quite often willing to work out every other problem.
Right.
Once the rent is late or not getting paid, the landlord doesn't want to talk about anything else until the rent is paid.
For sure.
So always pay the rent. And if you can't pay the rent, make sure you talk to your landlord before it's due, so that there's not a surprise.
Right. Yes, sometimes, they're human beings as well, so they will understand if there's a problem with work or whatever, a sickness today, or something like that. Or to just...
today we're sitting in the middle of a coronavirus scare.
Yes.
And some people who, maybe a dishwasher in a restaurant, and the restaurant doesn't have any business right now. Sure. And so they send the dishwasher home. The dishwasher is an hourly employee, normally making enough to pay the rent.
Yes.
But this month, because he's not going to work half the time, he's not going to have the money.
Right. Special circumstances like that, landlords for sure.
Talk to the landlord.
Yes.
Not all of them are going to be friendly and cooperative and whatever, but the more you make it not a surprise, the easier it'll be for most of those.
And if you're a tenant that has always paid your rent on time and does not give any problems to the landlord, more than anything, the landlord will be willing to help and give a hand.
Right.
That's awesome. Again, thank you, Phil, so much for your time.
Delighted to be here.
And yes, Phil Livingston, everybody, and thank you, everyone, for listening to the Houston Real Estate Talk with Stone & Fields.